Thank you very much, especially for your stamina. This is really the hardcore group that you've been able to stay the whole time and be able to, can you hear? Is that okay? All right. So I'm going to grab a stool here. We've actually heard a lot of very interesting talks today. We had a lot of very interesting discussions, and I'm going to kind of round out the day talking about this new color system that we've developed for the industry. So. It's the ColorCodex system, and it's a system that was developed to try and help bring some structure and means to reference color in our industry. And so the first part of the talk is going to be a little bit more of a background, and so I always kind of describe this as gemologists lost in color space. This is kind of a reference to the 1960s television program, Lost in Space. But the reason I do this, and because it's always kind of surprised me that in our industry, we're all about color. Outside of colorless or white diamonds, the industry is all about color. We've been around for centuries, and yet we still struggle with the means to accurately or consistently describe color, reference color, set boundaries for color varieties, and so on and so forth. And I just find this ironic because this is what we're all about. And so to kind of go back a little bit, I want to explain, this is a kind of simplified diagram that I developed to kind of communicate how I think most in our industry kind of view color. They view it in a very kind of linear way, from colors that start out to, let's see, we have a pointer, you have paler shades that extend out to more richly or deeply colored shades. And so it's a very simplified way of viewing it, but actually when we talk about color, color is a more complex model. So it's actually a three-dimensional color space, represented what you see here, where you have the hue is around the circle, the individual hues. You have saturation, which extends out from the middle, and on the vertical axis, you have the influence of tone. And it's these combinations of these three features which are actually responsible and give us the color that we see. And so it's a more complex model to understand color, but I find most people in the industry or in the trade, especially for consumers, they're not really inclined to take the time to gain a better understanding of color science. What we have, though, is we have some ways that have been developed to reference this color. So ones that were developed for other industries are things such as the Munsell color book. For the paint industry, these are paint chips. Other industries use it as well. You have Pantone, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. The textile industry or the print industry use these heavily. And they've been adopted and adapted for use in the gemstone industry as well. We have a couple of products, the Gem Dialogue as well as the World of Color, which utilize these as a base and try to apply them to our industry. So there are others that have been available in the past, but these are ones that are still commercially available today. We have some digital versions. We heard Omar talk about the ICA is also coming out with one. I highlight here GemiWizard because I think within the context of this technology, really what Menachem has done with this is he's probably maximized the potential of what you're able to accomplish here. Now, I'm not taking much time to talk about these other color systems. Actually, for those of you who are participants of the GILC meeting in Tucson, you probably heard Billy Hughes give a very good review of the various color systems that are available now, the ones that I'm describing here, as well as several others. But in that, towards the end of her discussion, one of the things that she mentioned is there's kind of a fundamental limitation which we find with all of these color systems, and that comes to the gamut of color which they're able to actually present and represent. And so this is a very simplified diagram that you see here, and this is the area of color that we're able to reproduce, whether through printing or on computer screens. But what we see is from the eye's ability to perceive color, the gamut of color is much, much larger. And this is also the gamut of color that you're able to find in gemstones. And so you have certain fundamental challenges which are available or which are happening with the systems that we currently have for the industry. And so to kind of show what I mean here, I'm using the Munsell color book. This is a yellow gemstone that was submitted to the laboratory. And this is the Munsell page, which most closely represents this stone. But the Munsell system, as I had described, these are painted chips of color. And so you can see on one side the intensity of the color that we find in this gemstone is kind of outside the gamut of color, which is represented on these paint chips. But also the medium, it's a flat, opaque paint chip. It doesn't translate well or easily to a transparent gemstone, the way color is presented or represented in faceted gemstones. You have areas of brilliance, you have areas of color intensity, color reflections. You also have areas of extinction. And all of this will kind of, this mosaic appearance of color will also shift and move as you kind of tilt the stone. And this is something that's very hard to compare against something which is opaque and flat. This is especially kind of evident in the red area of color. So here's a very nice, very vibrantly, very richly saturated ruby, and this is the color page of the Munsell book that most closely represents rubies. And so you can see it's quite challenging to try and use that system to describe or document color of such stones. So where does that kind of leave us? We have, as I'm describing, we have several systems or products that are available to the industry today. However, none of them seem to adequately present or represent color as we see them in gemstones. And I say that because I feel they've been around for a long time, these various color systems, and if they really accomplished this well, I think they would have been adopted by the industry by now. And the major factors being what I mentioned before, these are limitations in the gamut of color they're able to represent, as well as, again, the transparent gemstones are a three-dimensional body. They're interacting with light as it kind of reflects through it and comes back out, creating brightened areas of brilliance, color reflections, as well as areas of blackened extinction. And so where has that led us to? I think about 15 years ago or so is when we started to see the introduction of these trade terms. And I think this is a direct result of the fact that we don't have a system to properly describe certain types of colors. So the industry has started to go back to things like trade terms. I think most of you probably know my position on it. I think it's a little bit unfortunate. It's a fact, it's a reality in the industry, and so I don't think we're going to be able to go back from that right now. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But this is one of the ramifications of not having a system that can really accomplish this, this goal. So now I think, though, we have the opportunity to improve on this. Over the past 3 years, I've been developing this ColorCodex system, and I developed it specifically in response to these kinds of developments of the trade terms and the lack of structure which is in these trade terms. And so I just want to introduce you a little bit to the ColorCodex system. Some basic principles. It best mimics the way color is seen in transparent and faceted gemstones. And this is through the innovation of a pattern color window which creates the impression of brilliancy as well as extinction. It's an observer-based color comparison system, which means with very little practice or very little instruction, it becomes very intuitive. So it's easy to use, and most importantly, it allows for consistent and repeatable results. It actually also works for whether the stones are loose or mounted. It works equally as well. Some of the other things I did with this system, or I didn't do with this system, was I purposefully did not design this in a way that was intended to try and dictate how colors have to be described. So, as we were talking before with color, how someone expresses color depends on so many factors. Their education with color, maybe their familiarity with color science, but you can even have cultural differences or regional differences in how someone is going to describe color. I can use an example of something like a greenish yellow. Some people might call a particular color greenish yellow or slightly greenish yellow. Someone else may describe it as a green yellow. Someone may describe it as chartreuse. I didn't want the system to be complicated by that and to distract from the intended purpose. So as a result, I chose a numeric convention. And so the numeric convention, the beauty of a numeric convention is that the users still have the freedom to describe color in the way that they see appropriate or they see fit or the way that they perceive it. However, anyone regardless of who is using it, they're going to be able to come and utilize this system to come to the same objective numeric indicators for a particular color of a stone. So on each of these sheets, there are 13 sheets in the ColorCodex system, and it represents the full spectrum of color. We're going to find each color window is represented by two sets of numbers. The first set of numbers is across the horizontal. So these are different hues. This is the transition of hue across a page. And these are evenly numbered. The second number represents the intensity level of a particular hue. And these are actually odd numbers. And so by combining these two features, these two numeric values, you get the specific color reference for a stone. And so here I highlighted this one. So for example, if you had a stone that matches this color window, the ColorCodex reference for this color would be a 32-11. And so whether somebody might want to describe this color one way or another way, the important point is they would both come to the same numeric reference. So it is an observer-based system. So you want to move the stone to find which column of color best matches the stone, as well as the level of intensity which is matching the stone. And so you want to basically highlight which color window most closely resembles the stone. But the numeric convention that I chose when developing this system was done on purpose because it recognized the fact that you're going to have transitional colors, or colors that fall between two color windows. So as an example here, there's a yellow sapphire, which falls between, in color, it falls between the column of 50 and 52 at about the 09 level of color intensity. And so the numeric value, the ColorCodex value for this, would be a 5109. So the system has already anticipated and foreseen colors that are going to fall in between these color windows, and so the numeric value already fundamentally exists. Now, when it comes to colors in general, but also gems in particular, we find many colors are modified by nuances of gray or brown. This is the influence of tone. So this is the vertical axis that I was illustrating before. And so the ColorCodex system was specifically developed to handle the influence of tone through the use of overlays. So there are actually 5 tonal levels of overlays which you can use to further modify the color appearance. And so this is just an example. If you're using, here there's a first level, a G1 overlay. So you would have a color reference, for example, something like 3407 plus a G1. And so this is really the kind of ColorCodex reference or the indicator that identifies the color of that stone. Also, we're taking a lot of color data on all of these windows throughout the system, and this is to be able to plot the coordinates within various color systems that exist. But this is much more challenging than most people probably realize. Most people think it's very easy or quick to take this kind of spectral data, but first you have to find standards, you have to decide which area of color space or which system of color space you're going to use. And then there's also the technical details about getting consistent, repeatable, robust spectroscopic data. So here's an example of data that we collect from individual cells. And what I wanted to point out here, so we get all of this three-dimensional X, Y, Z axis coordinates for these colors. But what I decided to do was to really focus on the dominant wavelength of color. And I chose that because the dominant wavelength, I think, is something that our industry, gemologists in particular, are going to be able to relate to better. So everyone is familiar with looking at a desk model spectroscope or a handheld spectroscope. And so when they're seeing the red end of the spectrum, they're dealing about 700 nanometers. When they're over on the opposite end, but the violet and blue, we're over around 400 nanometers. And so this is something which all gemologists and people in the trade, I think, are very familiar with. Even consumers, when they go out and they look at a rainbow, you have the Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. These are all wavelengths in the visible spectrum. And so we're using, for color space, we're using a CIE chart from 1931. The innovation of this chart was that it actually correlated specific wavelengths to color descriptions. And so this is how the ColorCodex system kind of plays out in the 13 sheets that we have. It's very effective, and again, I think the dominant wavelength is going to be most readily understood. One thing I want to point out is this lower quadrant here over in the left. We see a lot of congestion of data. And that's because in 1931, this area of color space, they hadn't really refined well enough. So in 1976, they redid this color system. And so you see the region from green to blue to violet into purple has greatly expanded in this area. And so when we expand that area, while you had a lot of convergence of color data from the previous version, you start to see discrete populations within the ColorCodex system as well in this area. And so that's kind of the background for the technical people who are in the audience. These are things that we intend for when we publish the system. But in essence, this is a tool for the industry. And so these are all sectors of the industry that have already started to acquire the system. We don't try to tell people how to use it, it's a tool. So everyone should use it for the way that best suits their purposes. But just as an example, for appraisers or valuers, they're able to use this to reference color for replacement value or replacing like with like. For gem dealers or suppliers, this can help better match stones and fulfill inquiries. It also helps even some of the people that have gotten it, communication between offices, which are in different areas of the world. When they have the ColorCodex system, they're able to communicate and discuss colors of stones that are being offered to them or which they need for particular calls. For jewelers, it helps them to better communicate their needs to suppliers. This can help avoid a lot of this transfer, the sending of stones back and forth. Their suppliers are able to, with a ColorCodex reference, they're able to tell their suppliers whether they have what they need, and the supplier can answer what they have. For trade organizations, such as the ICA, for CIBJO, AGTA, and so forth, it's actually a great tool to help for communication, to help better understand what are these gem varieties which are based on color, what are trade terms, and what are the specific areas of color that they're describing. For young gemologists or those entering the trade, for schools, it's a very good tool to help them learn efficiently and ramp up their learning curve about colors. We all know from being in this industry, this all comes through attrition normally for all of us. We've had to learn about recognizing the green, how the green of a tsavorite is different from the green of an emerald, for example. And this is something which can help, because it's a full color system, it works for all of the gem varieties. So it can help actually accelerate this learning for them. As a laboratory, this last one has particular meaning for labs. This can be used to better establish criterion for the consistency in color descriptions, varietal calls, and trade terms. And so this is what I'm going to talk about. The last part of this is going to be this application side. And again, because I'm a laboratory, this is where I can talk about. Some of the other areas, these are more trade-related applications. But here what we find, especially in terms for varietal name designations, we find a lot of applications for the system. Here are just a few suggestions of that, but there are actually many throughout the industry. This is actually a slide I borrowed, or an image I borrowed from Michael at the SSCF. He gave a presentation on a very similar, on virtually the same topic at the European Gemological Symposium just this past May. And what I wanted to point out is what he highlights, basically, so we have many gemstone varieties which are based on color. And so within the trade, this is based on really color only. But in the laboratories, what we also try to do is we also try to develop objective means to better refine and standardize varietal calls. So we'll use things such as spectroscopy and or chemical composition. But what we've also used as laboratories in the past, this is a very common application, are the use of master stones or master sets. So any of you that have gone through the work to put together a master set, you understand how complicated and time-consuming this is, how difficult this can be to put together one master set. So now imagine you're an organization which has not just one location, but you have 2 or 3 locations, or other organizations, they have maybe 10 locations. Try to replicate that set of master stones. It's incredibly difficult. And then if you have, so you have one organization that has 10 outlets, you have other organizations around the world. They're going to have different master stones. Then you start to talk about trade associations. Then you start to talk about people in the industry. You can see why we have not been able to actually develop a more harmonized view of establishing things like varietal calls or things like trade terms. Master sets are really, it's a difficult way of trying to accomplish this. And so this is what has led to the development and the use of color charts. As Michael talked about Munsell, the ColorCodex, SSCF is one of the labs that has a system. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to now highlight just some examples here. And so I'm going to use corundum, because corundum has a number of varieties which are based solely on color. These are all sapphires, the obvious one, blue sapphire, green sapphire, yellow sapphire, padparacha, and so on and so forth. But the one I want to talk about is this kind of ruby pink sapphire, or actually more properly, non-ruby borders, ruby and non-ruby borders. Because is this just a color intensity issue? For those of you who remember, the ICA put together several years ago a ruby pink sapphire master set. They used Verneuil synthetics. And so this was one particular hue of red, or pink to red, where you saw the intensity graduation where they suggested a border. And so is that the only consideration? But what about when the color starts to transition towards increasing amounts of orange? There's also a border there where at a certain point the stone has become too orangey to now fall within a ruby classification. Then on the opposite side, you have the progression of an increasing purplish modifier, where you're going to have, at a certain point, a boundary where a stone is no longer classified as a ruby. So it's not just a color intensity issue. You also have the aspect towards the orange, the aspect towards the purplish, and indeed you even have it on the vertical scale with tones. And so, let me go back just a moment. So when we talk about those kind of boundaries, when we look to see if we can create more objective spectroscopic data or chemical data, we find chromium's the primary chromophore, but you have other elements, trace elements, vanadium, iron, titanium, and others, which relative to the intensity or the concentration of chromium is also going to modify the color. So these are relative concentrations, which are also important. And then you have color zones, the area where you're testing or analyzing the chemistry of a stone may not be the area of color that's actually representing the appearance of the stone. And then you also have path length. In a strict sense, you can have the same absolute numbers in terms of the concentrations of these various elements, but if you're dealing with a 1/2 carat stone, or you're dealing with a 6 or a 7 carat stone, the color intensity is going to be different, or the color appearance is going to be different, strictly due to path length. And so we see it's not possible to do something more objective through the analytical natures, applications that we have. But the ColorCodex, it's all based on color. And so I just want to show how this kind of plays out. In the first sheet of the ColorCodex system, we find, this is the 10 through 18 series, actually pink is a very large area of color. This is, as you move towards the left in this direction, it's actually getting increasingly more purplish. But all of this area of color, this is based on stones that were submitted to the laboratory, still fall within what we call the pink sapphire. The only area where we started to see ruby on this particular page was down here in the corner. It was the next page, this series of 2028, where we really find the main region of ruby classification. So you see, here's the kind of classical version. These here are the classical kind of versions of color intensity between pink, sapphire, and ruby. But you can see also as you move towards the orangey side of the ruby border, in the paler shades, you even start to encounter classifications of a padparacha as opposed to a pink sapphire. And then in the next page, which is the 30 series here, we even further expand the borders for padparacha and the boundary between, for example, padparacha and an orange sapphire. But so this is an example of how the ColorCodex system can be used to establish these boundaries in a way that everyone can understand and everyone can visualize and see. Another area that I wanted to demonstrate it with is the iron-bearing tourmalines. So here on the green side, we have verdite, and on the blue side, we have indicolite. And so this is something that, again, the ColorCodex system has been very useful for. So this was probably the bluest color of tourmaline we've had submitted to the laboratory. And so here it allowed us to create a boundary of where the endpoint is. As you go further to the right, the stones become increasingly more violetish when you look at the system. It's not that I suppose we couldn't potentially have them. We haven't encountered them yet. Actually, the more violetish colors is where you find in the copper-bearing, the cupriate tourmalines. So this is extending towards the left. So if we go to the next page in the other direction, the 80 to 88 series, we see over here on the far right, there is a column of color which has a little bit of a greenish modifier, which can still be present and classified as an indicolite tourmaline. But then as we continue to the left, we see we get increasingly greenish modifiers. And so now it's taken it outside of the indicolite varietal call. And I included this stone down here as an example because this was a kind of green-blue tourmaline which was submitted to the laboratory. And the client was adamant that this stone should be called indicolite. And I told him, for me, this is not an indicolite because it's too green. The indicolite is a blue color. Unfortunately, at that time, the ColorCodex system wasn't developed and hadn't been unveiled, so I wasn't able to kind of be able to demonstrate for him where the color of his stone falls versus where our laboratory recognizes the border of an indicolite call. Another example I wanted to use, this is where we're able to combine things such as objective spectral criterion together with observer-based color criterion. This is the difference between cobalt spinel and blue spinel. So for some of you, you might think, well, it's easy. Cobalt spinel is spinel that has cobalt in it. But I just have a few examples here that we learned as time went on that cobalt is actually not as rare in spinel as we originally thought. And so all of these colors have varying concentrations or traces of cobalt in them. So it's not just merely the presence of cobalt. So when we talk about cobalt spinel, we can look at the spectra and we find that these are stones that are dominated by cobalt 2+ absorption. They have minor influence of Fe2+ and Fe3+, but really the dominant absorptions and chromophore is related to cobalt. When we look at blue spinel, we find there's a difference. Here we have a much stronger influence of the ferric and ferrous iron absorptions relative to the cobalt 2+ absorption. So here's again how laboratories try to establish more objective criterion to complement what they're doing and for consistency in terms of varietal calls. But we don't expect the industry, and we don't think the industry is going to be able to walk around with spectrophotometers all the time. So the thing that's nice is that what we see represented in those absorption spectra that I showed is that there's also a visual difference between what we classify as a cobalt spinel and what we classify as a blue spinel. And this is where the ColorCodex system comes in for application for everyone. We can use the criterion from the laboratory to establish these boundaries. We can set it up on the ColorCodex system for the entire industry to have access to that. There are other ones where we've found particular applications. The copper bearings are Paraíba type tourmalines, boundaries such as emerald and green beryl, and so forth and so on. We're doing that now. We're working in the laboratory and establishing all of these boundaries. There are a number of laboratories that have acquired the system, and so kind of behind the scenes, we're having discussions also to see about how we can try to harmonize for better consistency between organizations. And now I want to just kind of finally come back. My time is up, I see. So I want to end with these trade terms. So I'm going to use the example of a pigeon's blood. So here you have 5 stones. Again, I don't want to get into the discussion about whether the industry should use it or shouldn't use it. Trade terms like this are a reality. They're a fact now. I don't think there's any going back. So, but what's the reality of what we find in the trade? These are just 5 stones, which I've gotten from one dealer in New York City. I actually got about 30 stones from him. And all of them had this designation of a pigeon blood color on the gemstone report. And so we see you have stones here that are pinkish in color. You have stones that are purplish in color. You have stones actually a very nice red, like this one over here. But also you have stones which are dark. They're blackish, they're almost over-colored. All of them got this heralded pigeon blood color classification. And so what you find is there's really no structure to terms such as this today. And this is why organizations like the ICA has talked about this in the past, GILC, CIBJO in the coming Congress, they're going to be talking about it, AGTA and so on and so forth. The industry is now trying to define these in a better way. And so again, I want to show this slide from before. This is why we haven't been able to really define it well up until now using one of these color systems. And it's again this gamut of color which you have. Because a ruby such as this, the intensity and the vibrancy of this color is just not well represented in these systems. But this is actually the specific reason why I started looking at developing this. So it's this expanded gamut of color, which is where I focused primarily on. And so the ColorCodex system is actually well suited to help the industry address these issues. So just to kind of wrap it up, because I'm over time now, this was developed for the industry, developed by a gemologist for gemologists or for the gemstone industry. It's observer-based, and so it's easy to use, intuitive. It allows for consistent and repeatable results, and the reason for this is because it best mimics the way color presents or represents itself in faceted gemstones. But really, we have a table out here that has a system. You should just take a look at it, give it a try, and see what you think with the system. Because the proof is, I can talk all I want about the system, but really it comes down to whether the system really helps you to recognize the color. You can ask Thomas. Thomas has one of the sets as an example in his lab. One of the other things that we've looked at, just to kind of end with, is lighting. We realized that consistent lighting is an important thing. We didn't really find a good full spectrum light out there that was usable, so now I've also gotten into the lighting field where we're engineering a full spectrum light. You don't have to wait for this to be developed. There's a prototype sitting out there. What's important is you're just using consistent lighting, so you're always using the same light. But I tried to rush through things because I know we were tight on time. For more information, you can look at the website, www.colorcodex.com. And other than that, I want to thank you for your time and your attention.